The morning of September 7th, 1947, was warm and humid in Harlem, with temperatures already in the mid-70s by 9 o'clock, and the kind of thick air that suggested afternoon thunderstorms might develop. St. Philip's Episcopal Church on West 134th Street was filling with congregants arriving for the 10 o'clock Sunday service, families dressed in their Sunday clothes walking up the steps and through the large wooden doors into the sanctuary. Margaret Moultrie Johnson was 63 years old in September 1947 and had been living in Harlem for approximately 15 years after moving north from Charleston to be near her children. Margaret lived in a small apartment on West 137th Street and worked as a domestic worker for several white families in Manhattan, cleaning their homes and caring for their children. Margaret was known as a deeply religious woman who attended St. Philip's Episcopal Church every Sunday without fail and who participated in the church's charitable activities throughout the week. Margaret worked for a family named the Hartleys, who lived in a large apartment on the Upper East Side. Robert Hartley was approximately 55 years old, owned a manufacturing company that produced textiles, and employed Margaret to clean his home, cook meals, and help care for his two teenage children. Hartley paid Margaret $12 per week, which was typical wages for domestic workers in 1947, but barely sufficient to cover Margaret's rent, food, and other expenses. And Margaret had worked for the Hartley family for 3 years and performed her duties diligently, despite the low wages and the often demeaning treatment she received from employers who viewed domestic workers as inferior. On the morning of September 7th, Margaret arrived at St. Philip's Church at approximately 9:45 and took her usual seat in a pew toward the middle of the sanctuary. Margaret was wearing a dark blue dress and hat appropriate for church, carrying her Bible and purse. Margaret noticed that several other members of the congregation were present, including families she had known for years, and with whom she exchanged quiet greetings before the service began. At approximately 9:50, Robert Hartley entered the church with his wife Eleanor and their 2 children. The Hartleys lived on the Upper East Side, but had recently begun attending St. Philip's Church because Robert's business partner, who was also white, was a member of the congregation and had invited the Hartleys to visit. St. Philip's was one of the few churches in Harlem that had some white members alongside its predominantly black congregation, reflecting the church's historical roots and its commitment to integrated worship. Margaret saw Hartley enter and felt immediate discomfort. Margaret had never expected to encounter her employer at church, particularly not at St. Philip's, which served primarily black residents of Harlem. Margaret had always maintained strict separation between her work life, where she was required to be deferential and subservient to white employers, and her church life, where she was a respected member of a community of equals. Hartley saw Margaret sitting in the pew and walked directly toward her. Hartley's wife and children followed behind him. When Hartley reached Margaret's pew, he stopped and spoke in a voice loud enough that nearby congregants could hear clearly. Hartley stated that he was surprised to see his maid at church, that he hoped she had cleaned his apartment properly before coming here, and that he would need her to come in early on Monday to make up for any work she had missed by attending church on Sunday morning. Margaret sat in the pew looking straight ahead, without responding to Hartley. The term maid was commonly used by white employers to refer to domestic workers, but the way Hartley said it carried an unmistakable tone of ownership and dismissiveness. The implication that Margaret's attendance at church represented time stolen from her work for Hartley was particularly insulting, given that Margaret worked Monday through Saturday and considered Sunday her one day of rest. Hartley continued speaking, stating that Margaret should remember that he paid her wages and that she should be grateful for the employment he provided. Hartley's tone and words conveyed clearly that he considered Margaret's presence at church to be presumptuous, and that he viewed her primarily as his servant rather than as a fellow human being entitled to worship. Several congregants sitting nearby heard this exchange and turned to look at what was happening. Some appeared uncomfortable witnessing their fellow church member being publicly humiliated by a white employer. Others looked away, not wanting to become involved in a situation that might create problems for them. The minister had not yet entered the sanctuary to begin the service, and the church was filled with the kind of pre-service quiet conversation that made Hartley's loud comments particularly noticeable. Margaret stood up slowly from the pew, gathered her Bible and purse, and walked out of the church without speaking to Hartley or to anyone else. Margaret walked down the steps of St. Philip's Church, along West 134th Street, and back toward her apartment on West 137th Street. Margaret's face remained composed, showing no visible emotion despite the humiliation she had just experienced. Margaret understood that responding to Hartley at church would accomplish nothing. Hartley had power as her employer and as a white man in 1947 America, and any attempt by Margaret to defend herself would likely result in her losing her job and being unable to find other employment. Margaret walked home and sat in her small apartment feeling the acute shame of what had occurred. The shame came not from anything Margaret had done, but from being treated as less than human in front of her church community, from having the space where she sought spiritual comfort and community belonging invaded by the same demeaning treatment she endured at work, and from knowing that Hartley felt entitled to humiliate her publicly without fear of consequences. Margaret's son, Ellsworth, known as Bumpy, lived in Harlem and visited his mother regularly. Bumpy was 41 years old in September 1947 and had established himself as one of the most powerful figures in Harlem's criminal economy through his control of illegal gambling operations. Bumpy maintained a close relationship with his mother, despite the significant differences between her life as a religious domestic worker and his life as a crime boss. Bumpy arrived at Margaret's apartment that afternoon at approximately 3 o'clock, as he did most Sundays after his mother returned from church. Bumpy immediately noticed that his mother seemed troubled and withdrawn in ways that were uncharacteristic. When Bumpy asked what had happened, Margaret initially stated that nothing was wrong. But Bumpy persisted with questions, and Margaret eventually described what had occurred that morning at St. Philip's Church, how Robert Hartley had called her his maid in front of the congregation, how Hartley had stated that Margaret should be grateful for his employment, how Hartley had suggested that Margaret's church attendance interfered with her work obligations, and how Margaret had walked out of the service feeling humiliated in front of her community. Bumpy listened to his mother's account without visible reaction, but those who knew him understood that such stillness indicated intense focus and carefully controlled anger. Bumpy asked several specific questions about Hartley: what business he owned, where he lived, what he looked like, how long Margaret had worked for him, and whether other congregants had witnessed the incident. Margaret answered these questions, still feeling upset by the memory of standing in the church pew while Hartley had spoken to her as though she were his property rather than a fellow human being seeking to worship. Bumpy did not tell his mother what he intended to do about the situation. Bumpy simply stated that Hartley's behavior had been unacceptable and that Margaret should not worry about the matter further. Bumpy suggested that Margaret not return to work for the Hartley family on Monday, and that Bumpy would ensure she had income while she looked for other employment. Margaret agreed, relieved that she would not have to face Hartley again, but uncertain what would happen next. As Bumpy walked away from his mother's apartment building that evening, he thought carefully about what had occurred and what it represented. The immediate problem was that Robert Hartley had publicly humiliated Bumpy's mother by treating her as inferior in a sacred space where she should have been respected as an equal. But Bumpy recognized that Hartley's action represented a much larger pattern of how white employers treated black domestic workers throughout New York, as servants who existed solely to serve white families, who had no dignity or rights that needed to be respected, and who could be humiliated publicly without consequences. Bumpy understood that responding effectively required addressing both the specific insult to his mother and the broader system of racial hierarchy that Hartley represented. Simply threatening or harming Hartley personally would accomplish little. Hartley might be frightened, but other white employers would continue treating black workers with contempt, and the underlying dynamic where racial humiliation occurred without consequences would remain unchanged. What was needed was a response that would destroy Hartley's business and reputation completely, that would create deterrent effects, making other white employers reconsider whether they could safely humiliate black workers, and that would demonstrate to Harlem's black community that racial insults would trigger systematic consequences. This required economic destruction rather than personal revenge. Bumpy spent September 8th and 9th gathering intelligence about Robert Hartley and his business operations. Bumpy enlisted 6 trusted associates who conducted systematic investigation into who Hartley was, how his business functioned, where his manufacturing facilities were located, who his suppliers and customers were, what financial obligations he had, and what vulnerabilities could be exploited. The investigation revealed extensive information within 48 hours. Hartley owned a textile manufacturing company called Hartley Manufacturing that operated a factory in Lower Manhattan. The company employed approximately 40 workers who operated machinery that produced fabric sold to clothing manufacturers throughout the Northeast. Hartley had owned the business for 18 years and had been moderately successful, generating enough revenue to maintain his Upper East Side apartment and comfortable lifestyle. Most significantly, the investigation revealed that Hartley's business depended heavily on black workers, even while Hartley himself maintained attitudes of racial superiority. 23 of Hartley Manufacturing's 40 employees were black workers who operated machinery, loaded and unloaded shipments, maintained equipment, and performed other essential functions. Hartley paid these black workers lower wages than white workers performing equivalent jobs. Hartley also maintained segregated facilities in the factory with separate bathrooms and break areas for black and white employees. The investigation also revealed that Hartley's business depended on relationships with several key customers, large clothing manufacturers who purchased fabric from Hartley Manufacturing on regular schedules. These relationships were essential to Hartley's revenue, and losing even one or two major customers would create significant financial pressure. Bumpy recognized that Hartley's dependence on black workers created vulnerabilities that could be systematically exploited. Bumpy also recognized that Hartley's dependence on customer relationships meant that damaging his reputation or creating doubts about his reliability would undermine his business. This created multiple pressure points that could be activated simultaneously. Bumpy spent September 10th through September 12th developing a comprehensive strategy that would operate through multiple channels. The strategy involved labor action to disrupt Hartley's production, economic pressure on Hartley's customer relationships, social pressure through exposure of his treatment of workers, and coordination with community leaders to create broader consequences. The first component was labor disruption. Bumpy instructed associates to contact the 23 black workers employed by Hartley Manufacturing and to explain that Hartley had publicly humiliated an elderly black woman at church by calling her his maid and suggesting she should be grateful for his employment. The workers were offered assistance in finding employment at other factories at equivalent or higher wages. Within 3 days, 18 of the 23 black workers had quit Hartley Manufacturing, creating immediate and severe production disruptions. The second component was customer pressure. Bumpy arranged for information to be delivered to Hartley's major customers, explaining that Hartley Manufacturing maintained discriminatory employment practices, including segregated facilities and unequal pay for black workers. Several of these customers were northern companies that publicly opposed racial discrimination and that did not want to be associated with businesses that maintained Jim Crow-style segregation. 3 major customers canceled their contracts with Hartley Manufacturing within 1 week. The third component was supplier pressure. Hartley Manufacturing depended on suppliers who provided raw materials for textile production. Bumpy contacted these suppliers through intermediaries and indicated that continuing to supply Hartley Manufacturing would result in complications for their businesses. Several suppliers stopped delivering materials to Hartley's factory, forcing Hartley to find alternative sources at higher prices. The fourth component was social exposure. Information about Hartley's treatment of his black workers and about his public humiliation of Margaret Johnson at St. Philip's Church was shared with members of Harlem's religious community. Several ministers mentioned in their sermons that employers who treated black workers with contempt and who brought such attitudes into sacred spaces were violating Christian principles of human dignity. While no names were mentioned directly, enough details were provided that many congregants understood the reference was to Hartley. The fifth component was community mobilization. Bumpy worked with community leaders to organize a quiet but effective campaign where black domestic workers were advised to avoid seeking employment with the Hartley family, and where other families were informed about how Hartley had treated Margaret Johnson. This information network made it difficult for Hartley to hire replacement domestic workers after Margaret stopped coming to work. These 5 components began operating simultaneously on September 13th, 6 days after Hartley had insulted Margaret Johnson at St. Philip's Church. The cumulative effects created immediate and escalating problems for Hartley's business and personal life. By September 15th, Hartley discovered that 18 of his 23 black workers had quit without notice. Hartley attempted to hire replacements, but found that black workers throughout Lower Manhattan were unwilling to work for him once they learned about his discriminatory practices and his treatment of workers. The few white workers Hartley could find demanded wages higher than Hartley could afford to pay. By September 17th, 3 of Hartley Manufacturing's major customers had canceled their contracts, citing concerns about labor practices. Hartley attempted to explain that these cancellations were based on false information, but the customers stated that they had conducted their own inquiries and had decided to source fabric from other manufacturers who maintained better workplace conditions. By September 19th, Hartley's suppliers began refusing to deliver raw materials. When Hartley contacted them demanding explanation, and the suppliers stated vaguely that they had capacity constraints or that they were focusing on other customers. Hartley understood that something systematic was happening, but could not identify the source of the coordinated pressure. By September 22nd, Hartley Manufacturing's production had dropped by more than 70% due to labor shortages and material shortages. The few remaining workers could not maintain the production schedules that Hartley's remaining customers required. Additional contracts were canceled as Hartley failed to deliver orders on time. By September 25th, Hartley was facing financial crisis. Revenue had collapsed due to lost customers. Costs had increased due to higher wages for replacement workers and higher prices for materials from alternative suppliers. Hartley had outstanding loans from banks that he could no longer service. The factory was operating at minimal capacity with uncertain prospects for recovery. Throughout this period, Hartley attempted various strategies to address the crisis. Hartley tried to determine who was responsible for the coordinated pressure on his business, but could not identify any single source. Hartley attempted to rehire some of the black workers who had quit, offering higher wages, but these workers refused to return. Hartley attempted to convince customers who had canceled contracts to reconsider, but they remained unwilling to resume business. Hartley contacted his banks requesting extensions on loan repayments, but the banks grew concerned about Hartley Manufacturing's viability and began foreclosure procedures. By early October, approximately 4 weeks after Hartley had insulted Margaret Johnson, Hartley Manufacturing was approaching bankruptcy. The business that Hartley had built over 18 years was collapsing due to systematic economic pressure applied across multiple domains simultaneously. Hartley understood intellectually that the collapse was connected to his treatment of black workers and to the incident at St. Philip's Church. But Hartley had not imagined that such treatment could trigger consequences severe enough to destroy his entire business. On October 8th, Hartley Manufacturing ceased operations. Hartley posted notices informing remaining employees that the factory was closing permanently. Hartley began bankruptcy proceedings, acknowledging that he could not pay his debts and that his assets would be liquidated. Hartley's comfortable lifestyle on the Upper East Side came to an end as he faced financial ruin. The stress of the business collapse and financial devastation affected Hartley's health severely. Hartley had previously managed high blood pressure with medication, but the stress of losing everything he had built over 2 decades caused his condition to worsen substantially. Hartley suffered a stroke on October 15th that left him partially paralyzed on his left side. Hartley's family arranged for him to receive medical care, but his condition continued deteriorating. On October 28, 1947, Robert Hartley died at age 55 from complications related to his stroke and cardiovascular disease. The official cause of death was recorded as cerebral hemorrhage, and a medical condition that had been present for years, but that had been exacerbated by the extreme stress Hartley experienced during the collapse of his business and finances. Hartley's family arranged for his funeral to be held at St. Philip's Episcopal Church on November 1st, the same church where Hartley had insulted Margaret Johnson less than 2 months earlier. The choice of St. Philip's was made by Hartley's business partner, who remained a member of the congregation and who believed that Hartley should be buried from the church he had begun attending. The family had no awareness of the incident that had occurred in September or of the connection between that incident and the subsequent collapse of Hartley's business. The funeral was attended by approximately 40 people, including Hartley's family, his business associates, and some members of St. Philip's congregation. Margaret Johnson attended the service, sitting in the same pew where she had sat on September 7th when Hartley had humiliated her. Margaret's presence at the funeral was noticed by several congregants who remembered the incident from September and who understood the significance of Margaret witnessing Hartley's burial from the church he had defiled with his racist contempt. The minister conducting the service spoke about human mortality, the importance of treating others with dignity during life, and the hope of redemption. The service lasted approximately 1 hour, after which Hartley's body was taken to a cemetery in Queens for burial. Margaret remained in her pew after most other attendees had left, sitting quietly and reflecting on what had occurred over the previous 2 months. The destruction of Hartley's business and Hartley's death created effects that extended far beyond one employer's treatment of one domestic worker. The demonstration that publicly humiliating a black worker could trigger systematic economic destruction created cautionary awareness among other white employers in New York who employed black domestic workers and factory employees. Several employers who had maintained discriminatory practices and who had treated black workers with contempt began reconsidering whether such behavior was safe, understanding that if their treatment of workers became known, it might trigger similar coordinated responses. The successful use of coordinated economic pressure, labor disruption, customer pressure, supplier pressure, social exposure, the community mobilization provided a model that could be applied to other situations where black workers faced discrimination or abuse. The case demonstrated that black workers and black communities had economic power that could be mobilized systematically to impose consequences on employers who violated basic standards of human dignity. For Margaret Johnson specifically, the resolution provided a form of justice that the legal system could never have delivered. In 1947, there were no laws prohibiting employers from humiliating their domestic workers at church. There were no discrimination laws that would have given Margaret legal recourse. The justice Margaret received came not from government institutions, but from her son's strategic use of economic power to destroy someone who had treated her as less than human. The precedent that insulting Bumpy Johnson's family would trigger devastating consequences reinforced Bumpy's reputation as someone who protected his family with absolute commitment, and who had the resources and intelligence to destroy people who showed disrespect. This reputation created deterrent effects that prevented other incidents. People throughout Harlem and beyond understood that insulting or mistreating Johnson's family members was extraordinarily dangerous. The fact that Hartley's funeral was held at the same church where he had insulted Margaret created powerful symbolism that resonated throughout Harlem's black community. The message was clear: spaces that should be sacred and where all people should be treated with dignity would be protected, and those who violated such spaces with racist contempt would face consequences that could end in their complete destruction. The symbolism of Margaret sitting in the same pew for both the insult and the funeral emphasized that dignity could be defended and restored. The case illustrated principles that characterized Bumpy Johnson's most effective exercises of power. The response to Hartley's insult had been strategic rather than emotional. Bumpy had not immediately confronted Hartley or used violence. Instead, Bumpy had developed a comprehensive strategy that operated through multiple pressure points: labor, customers, suppliers, social networks, community mobilization, creating cumulative pressure that made Hartley's business unsustainable. The coordination across different domains demonstrated that effective power came from systematic thinking rather than dramatic gestures. No single action would have destroyed Hartley's business. Losing workers alone or losing customers alone would have been serious but potentially survivable. The combination of labor shortages, customer cancellations, supplier problems, damaged reputation, and inability to hire replacement workers created a situation where recovery was impossible. The patience with which the strategy was implemented, allowing several weeks for different pressure points to operate and for effects to accumulate, reflected understanding that lasting victories required changing underlying economic realities rather than winning immediate confrontations. The goal was not to scare Hartley temporarily, but to destroy his business completely so that he could never again humiliate black workers with impunity. The story of how Robert Hartley had insulted Bumpy Johnson's mother at church and how Hartley's funeral had been held at that same church became one of many narratives that circulated in Harlem about Johnson's protection of his family. The story emphasized the systematic nature of the response, the coordination of economic pressure across multiple channels, and the symbolic power of Hartley being buried from the same church he had defiled with racist contempt. Whether remembered precisely or embellished through retelling, the narrative captured essential truths about how Johnson understood power and how he exercised authority. Protection of family was absolute and non-negotiable. Racial humiliation triggered responses that were strategic and comprehensive. Economic pressure applied systematically could destroy opponents completely. Demonstrating capability to impose such consequences created deterrent effects that prevented future incidents. Real victories were measured not by dramatic confrontations, but by whether dignity was defended and whether those who violated human dignity faced consequences severe enough to change behavior patterns. The legacy extended beyond Hartley's individual case. The precedent that employers who humiliated black workers could face systematic economic destruction influenced how some employers treated their black employees. The demonstration that church spaces would be protected from racial contempt reinforced that certain boundaries would be defended regardless of who violated them. At the symbolism of Hartley's funeral being held at St. Philip's Church became a powerful reminder that actions had consequences and that dignity could be defended even against those who held economic and racial power. For the black community in Harlem and throughout New York, the Hartley case provided hope that racial humiliation did not have to be accepted as inevitable. The case showed that economic power could be mobilized to defend dignity, that coordination across different sectors could create leverage that individual actions could not achieve, and that strategic thinking could be more effective than either passive acceptance or impulsive violence. These outcomes required no celebration or exaggeration to demonstrate their value. A mother's dignity had been defended. A racist employer had been destroyed. A business built on exploitation had collapsed. A deterrent had been established. A community had demonstrated coordinated power. The legacy endured. Margaret Johnson continued living in Harlem and attending St. Philip's Church for the next several years. Margaret found other employment as a domestic worker, but never again encountered the kind of public humiliation she had experienced from Robert Hartley. Margaret understood that her son had defended her dignity in ways that fundamentally altered her sense of security and worth. When Margaret died in 1950, her funeral was held at St. Philip's Church, attended by family and by members of the congregation who remembered her as a woman of faith whose dignity had been challenged and defended. Bumpy Johnson continued operating in Harlem for another 21 years after the Hartley incident. Johnson was convicted of drug conspiracy in 1952 and served time at Alcatraz before returning to Harlem in 1963. Johnson died on July 7, 1968, of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant. Johnson's protection of his mother from Hartley's racist contempt was remembered by those who knew about it as an example of how Johnson defended family dignity and how he used strategic economic pressure rather than violence to achieve lasting victories. The quiet power of the resolution, documented through systematic pressure, rather than dramatic confrontation, achieving permanent destruction rather than temporary deterrence, demonstrating that racist humiliation would trigger consequences severe enough to end businesses and reputations, stood in contrast to narratives that often characterized stories about powerful figures. There was no shootout, and no public battle, no theatrical revenge. There was only systematic investigation, strategic coordination across multiple economic pressure points, patient execution allowing effects to accumulate, and complete destruction of an opponent through methods that were fundamentally economic rather than violent. This was the reality of how power operated when wielded by people who understood that defending family dignity required systematic responses, that economic relationships created vulnerabilities that could be exploited, that coordination across labor, customers, suppliers, and social networks created leverage that individual actions could not achieve, and that real victories were measured not by dramatic moments, but by whether dignity was defended, whether violators faced consequences severe enough to destroy their economic power, and whether deterrent effects prevented future violations.